Amy squirmed in the oversized leather chair, sweating profusely. She was waiting for her first therapy session to start, and she was absolutely riddled with anxiety. How had she even gotten here? A friend had an appointment she wasn't going to use, and rather than just cancel, she said Amy should take the slot. This was a well-respected psychiatrist in very high demand. The friend was so insistent that she actually drove Amy to the appointment and dropped her off. And this made Amy feel childish and pathetic, like she wasn't capable of taking care of herself or making her own decisions. So right off the bat, she was feeling anxious and insecure. Already indebted to this man sitting across from her, who she calls Dr. Dolian. He was decades older than her, dressed in a full suit and tie, and was endearingly goofy, with a sort of bumbling grandpa vibe, almost Mr. Rogers-like. He smiled often and had thick, expressive eyebrows, with a sparse beard and mustache. His pale blue eyes seemed kind and intense. The office was a clash of sentiments. It felt both scholarly and quirky, with masculine effects, like the walnut-colored leather chair she sat in, countered by more delicate touches, like the collection of china cups and saucers for the tea he was making when she came in. The door was a formidable heavy oak, but she could still hear the receptionist's muffled voice from the waiting room. There was also a sketch of a girl on the wall. Dr. Dolian had said it was a former patient who had had a horrific past, and she actually had drawn this picture for him. Maybe that was odd, the spectral presence of a former client watching over a new client. But Amy didn't dwell on it. There was too much else to focus on. Amy had tried an assortment of therapy and medication in the past and had never been able to shake her depression. But she had heard people rave about Dr. Dolian at the church they both attended. She had friends who were on the waiting list to see him, and he certainly seemed wise and impressive. So she really wanted to make it work this time. No doubt he could sense how anxious she was. He looked her up and down, then rose from his desk and moved over to the cupboard where he had a collection of Afghans. He started rifling through them, holding them up toward her, one at a time. Not saying anything, just giving a goofy little grin as he evaluated each match. He finally found one he was happy with, then moved toward Amy and draped it over her. It was an odd gesture, not to mention weirdly intimate for therapy. But Amy told herself not to worry about it. He was just trying to be playful and put her at ease. And actually, she was kind of grateful for it. The Afghan felt like an added layer of protection. As he settled into his seat, Amy thought back to the last time she'd seen him. 7 years earlier. His hair was browner then, not streaked with gray like it is now. He looked Amy directly in the eyes, and with another smile, made it clear that he remembered her too. "So," he said, "you couldn't stay away?" I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. My guest today is author Amy Nordhues, a survivor of both childhood sexual abuse and abuse as an adult in therapy. She's written about her story of therapy harm in a book titled Preyed Upon. Amy grew up in Atlanta, the oldest of 4 girls, and the only one of those girls to have been adopted. They were a devout Catholic family. Amy's mom, who was especially serious about her religion, was also withdrawn and emotionally distant. Meanwhile, her dad traveled frequently, and when he was home, he could be emotionally abusive, to the point that Amy sometimes felt like it was her role as the oldest to help protect her mom. This combination of harsh religiosity and distant parents not to mention the complicated dynamics that come with adoption, had a devastating effect on Amy's self-esteem. And she grew up feeling like there was something fundamentally wrong with her, with who she was. And as I'm sure many of you know, those deep-rooted feelings don't just go away once we're adults, not even when we busy ourselves with marriage, work, and raising a family. Things reached a tipping point after Amy's sister passed away in 2010.
And it just was sort of the domino that tipped the scales for me. All the depression that I'd been carrying, all the anxiety that I was dealing with up to that point, my struggles in a disconnected marriage, my struggles trying to be a good mom and feeling like I was failing miserably. And then when she passed away, I just kind of sunk into a deeper depression. And that's when I stopped going to church. Ironically, that is where my faith journey began, though, because in time, I reached out to a Celebrate Recovery. I didn't have an addiction, but you don't have to go to Celebrate Recovery. And it's just a Christian 12-step group. And that's kind of where I started to face my anger towards God, my frustration towards God and religion, kind of sort through all of that and start to develop a faith that was my own.
A history of abuse, low self-esteem, and a need to take care of others. Stop me if you've heard this one before. These are some of the hallmark traits that predators look for. The traits that so many abusers are cunningly adept at taking advantage of. Not that Amy ever expected her therapist to be a predator. Quite the opposite, really. When she started therapy, she had every reason to think that it would be safe, a healing place. Especially since Dr. Dolian was so well respected and seemed like such a kindly old man.
I began attending Celebrate Recovery at a local church, and the pastor's wife actually became my mentor in Celebrate Recovery, and we became very close friends. And she actually was the first one to recommend Dr. Dolian to me. He was a psychiatrist, but he did therapy. I later learned that he was also an elder at that church, this church that I had come to love and feel safe in, really the first church that ever felt like my own. So it was special to me. Many of my friends in Celebrate Recovery also recommended this doctor. In 2013, I decided I would give it a try. I was a new Christian and I loved that he was a church elder. I didn't know a lot about the Bible. I loved that he came so highly recommended. He could manage my medication and he did therapy. And he was an older grandfatherly type figure. So that felt safe to me. And I had always had a huge father figure void. And so he pretty quickly realized that and started to fill that role.
Then comes the first session, the last-minute opening, the embarrassment of being dropped off for an unscheduled appointment, the weird way he picked out an Afghan and draped it over her. Was that normal? Amy wondered as she tugged at the fabric. Was he being creepy, or was this just a caring older man who happened to be a little goofy? It had to be the later. Amy knew she was a deeply anxious person, and he was probably just trying to put her at ease. And first sessions in therapy are bound to be awkward, right? But looking back, she can see that he was setting a precedent.
It felt, you could say, like a red flag, but I immediately thought, it can't be wrong or he wouldn't be doing it. It can't be bad or he wouldn't be doing it. And he's old and he's just trying to lighten the mood and you're just so sensitive and you're so this and you're so that. And so any discomfort I felt at anything he did like that, I just blamed myself for it. And I thought if I was not so anxious, not so fearful, not so broken, that wouldn't have felt uncomfortable for me. We just assume that people that hold positions like doctor, church leader, even someone that's just 20, 30 years our senior, we assume that they are not in the wrong. So if something they're doing feels wrong, then it's something about how we're interpreting it.
Amy started seeing Dr. Dolian once a week. That was in April 2013. He was 65 at the time, and she was in her early 40s. It was hard for her to settle in at first. She was a cautious person, and she didn't always know how to read him. She was also a little weirded out by how much of his religion informed his practice. She hadn't expected that in therapy, especially not with a psychiatrist. And the spirituality of this non-denominational church was very different than the Catholic faith she had grown up with. Now, regular listeners to this podcast might have noticed that a number of episodes involve clinicians who are state-licensed therapists who practice out of a Christian framework. I promise I am not trying to pick on Christianity, not seeking those stories out on purpose. But I would say that about 90% of the people who have shared their stories with me so far were harmed in some sort of faith-based treatment. Of course, therapy abuse can and does occur in any context, secular or religious. But it's worth thinking about the unique ways in which spiritual authority can be wielded to manipulate and harm others. How the rhetoric of religion can yet be another tool in an abuser's arsenal. Despite her lingering unease, though, Amy knew if this is going to work, she'd have to let her guard down and really commit. And after a few months, she actually started looking forward to her appointment each week. Dr. Dolian was beginning to feel like a personal cheerleader, a steady source of support and encouragement. And that kind of reliable presence had been woefully lacking throughout her life. Near the end of that first year, though, Dr. Dolian changed the game.
It's Christmas time, and he said, since I wasn't able to get you anything for Christmas, I thought maybe I would offer you a foot rub or a shoulder rub. If there were alarm bells in our heads, they were screaming, and I was panicked, and I remember just wanting to escape through the floor, my face burning red, because sadly, I didn't think, no thank you, was an option. That would have been wonderful, right? I thought I had to pick one. And in my head, I just hear, pick one, pick one. This is so uncomfortable. This is so awkward. Oh my gosh, just pick one. Because heaven forbid I make him feel uncomfortable for making me feel uncomfortable. Again, I didn't think he would be offering it for any kind of nefarious reasons. And I started thinking, did I tell him I loved foot rubs when I was a kid? I bet I told him I did. I used to beg my sisters to rub my feet. I bet I told him that. And that's why he's suggesting that. Anyway, I made myself pick shoulders. I was just stiff as a board as he got up from his chair and walked over to my chair and sat down beside me. And I remember the touch was really light. It was cringy feeling. And he started to kind of rub my shoulders, and I said, feet. So he went to the other side of the office, sat down in his chair, kind of smiling at me, scooting up towards me. I made myself put my feet on the ottoman in front of me and kind of slink down in my chair, but not so much that it was easy. And I just made myself stare at him and pretend everything was normal. And like I said, the burden of making the room comfortable was on me. Again, he's being playful. He's being silly. Is this really a big deal? It's your feet. He's touching your feet. Oh my gosh, what bad thing is happening to you? What scary thing is happening to you? Again, just attack, self-attack every time. So he did. He rubbed my feet. Eventually, I started to relax with it, think it was sweet, because never in a million years would I feel any sexual attraction to this person. This is like a grandfather, and a goofy one at that. So he felt like a safe male. And I thought that God was rewarding me for my kind of newfound faith with a safe male, which is so sad.
I want to highlight the fact that Dr. Dolian didn't present her with a choice between him touching her or not touching her. The choice was feet or shoulders, enough for her to maybe feel like she had a little bit of agency, but it was an illusion of choice. He was going to touch her either way, and Amy's background had long since made it hard for her to resist this kind of intrusion.
I was a big people pleaser. I'm a peacemaker. I just want to do whatever I need to do in any situation to quickly get it back to being peaceful and comfortable, even if that means blaming myself. I had my space invaded when I was a child. I had already been molested. I had been molested by a priest. I had already had that happen to me. And so when that happens when you're young, I feel like it sends a message loud and clear that your body is not your own, your space is not your own, and you don't have any rights. You don't have the rights that normal people have. I didn't feel that I had the right, especially to tell a doctor or a religious leader or someone that was much older than me, no.
It's more than just wanting to avoid conflict. Amy is a deeply empathetic person, and she was always looking for ways to explain away Dr. Dolian's behavior as mere awkwardness or misplaced kindness. This is a particular form of mental gymnastics that I'm sure many abuse survivors can relate to. So he keeps rubbing her feet during sessions, and her alarm bells start to quiet. Maybe it was kind of sweet after all, and it was helping her relax. She even started using the ottoman in front of her chair, which she had avoided for months. It felt nice to finally let herself kick back some, for a little bit at least.
So this ottoman played a key role in the grooming process because eventually he would put his feet up on the ottoman next to mine. That was the way he had figured out to introduce physical contact again. Besides him touching my feet, besides him rubbing my feet, which I'm sure he got tired of doing, that was his next move. So in the middle of a conversation, he just kind of awkwardly and clumsily puts one foot up on the ottoman. And I thought, what is happening? Just keep talking, maintain eye contact. And then he put the other one up and I thought, oh, okay, he was going to put his feet up on the ottoman and maybe he froze at the last minute. It was strange. So he puts both feet up on the ottoman. And once I'm like, oh, okay, that's what's happening. And it's just his shoes touching my shoes. No big deal. You're not in danger. Then I just let it go. But then I came back the following week. He was taking off his shoes, not announcing it or do you mind if I... And I felt so panicked. And then I thought, Amy, my God, what is wrong with you? He's taking off his shoes. Who cares? But I thought, this is therapy. We're more like father-daughter. We're more like just conversing in a living room setting. It's okay. He just is taking off his shoes. That was just the first way that he could remove an article of clothing. During this time, I had to listen to a volunteer video on childhood sexual abuse so that I could volunteer in our church. And I was listening to it like, oh, I know all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And it said, slow removal of clothing. I just stopped in my tracks and I thought, is that? No, that's not what he's doing. But it was.
First it was his shoes, then his tie. Then he started removing his button-down shirt. So he'd be sitting there in just his undershirt, pants, and socks. And eventually he started removing his belt. With each discard of clothing came a seemingly plausible explanation. For instance, after one tearful session, Amy realized that she had gotten some of her mascara on his dress shirt when crying on his shoulder. She was his first client of the day, and so it made sense to Amy that he wouldn't want to risk going through the whole day with makeup on his shirt. From then on, this habit of partial undress became the norm, serving as both a cautionary undertone at the same time as giving the sense of being special. She loved that he felt comfortable enough to just relax when he was with her. More like it was a father-daughter relationship than a client and clinician. And he continued to ramp things up in other ways. Once he sat on the ottoman in front of her, grabbed a tissue, and started dabbing at the tears on her cheeks. Amy was embarrassed by this, but again, maybe he was just trying to be sweet. Then he made a show of complaining about his back hurting. His seat was just too uncomfortable, apparently. So he moved to the ottoman and sat next to Amy in the oversized chair. And that's where he sat from then on, shoulder to shoulder with her, every session. He even told her at one point that it was okay if she kissed him on the lips. That comment sent her spinning, and she analyzed it over and over later. There was no way she wanted to do that, but he seemed so sad and lonely sometimes. So she forced herself to give him a peck on the cheek next time she saw him. Maybe this was just some sort of daughterly affection. There was a profound disconnect at work here. Dr. Dolian had presented himself like a father figure, something Amy had always longed for. And that's how he first gained her trust. At one point, he told her that all of his other clients had prepared him for this moment, for his work with Amy. He wanted to be her knight in shining armor. But this father figure and rescuer dynamic was perverted by his steadily increasing fixation on physical connection. Honestly, his early tactics almost sound like a horny teenager sitting next to his crush. You know, maybe he subtly leans in against her first, shoulder grazing shoulder. Then he awkwardly puts his arm around her, always frantically calculating how he can take things a little further each time. That analogy might almost be funny if it wasn't so horrifying. If we were actually talking about teenagers and not an older clinician wielding a great deal of power over his younger, vulnerable patient.
In May, he offers to dance with me. you have to understand that all of the grooming tactics that he used were things that he learned from me in therapy. So I thought they were all therapeutic. For example, I told him that I never had a father figure. So I always wished I could have a father figure dance, a father figure song. So when he announced the next week that he brought a little radio and offered to dance with me, I thought that's why he was asking. And I, again, felt just as panicked as every other time. And just like every other time, I didn't think I could say no. Just like every time, I felt like there was something inherently wrong with me, that what he was requesting felt uncomfortable for me. When he danced with me that first time, I said, and it was brutally uncomfortable, but I made myself do it. And then I told him, I want to try to dance with you 1,000 times until it doesn't terrify me anymore. Because I thought that was the whole point, is that if I was healthy, it wouldn't have felt so scary. So I come back the next week, and when we're dancing, he grabs my butt and is clearly turned on. And I am so panicked, I don't know what to do. And so I just sort of robotically get through it and then vow to myself to never dance again. And that it was all my fault because men can't help being turned on. And it was my stupid idea to dance for the second time. And it was kind of my stupid idea the first time, because if I hadn't mentioned in therapy that I wanted that dance, he wouldn't have done it in the first place. So again, it all came back to me. And that's what makes it so hard for victims to tell, because we're not sure what our role is, because they use things we share with them against us.
Do you hear how rapidly the wheels were spinning in her mind? All the hoops she was trying to jump through to let him off the hook? Again, this is very common among abuse survivors. In her book, Amy describes it in this way. I believe the biggest burden for adult victims of sexual abuse is the double bind it creates. It forces us to act as participants in our own abuse, puppets in our own demise. It's worth pointing out that some of these dynamics are amplified in religious contexts, especially when purity culture is at play. Purity culture often places the burden entirely on women. It's the women's job to remain modest, to make sure she doesn't cause a man to stumble. Not only does she have to guard her own chastity, she also has to look out for the purity of her male peers. Because if a man acts out, he must have been provoked in some way. You know. Maybe she was asking for it. And when any sort of perceived immorality goes public, for too many, the knee-jerk reaction is to criticize and punish the woman. This is true in society at large, and it can be even more pronounced in certain religious communities, and not just Christianity. My father, for instance, is a devout Muslim. He has made remarks about women who wear hijabs, expressing the temptation and allure he finds in glimpses of their painted toes peeking out from beneath their modest attire. Men who want to sexualize women will find a way, and will somehow also find a way to blame her for it. The standard of women's purity is an ever-moving target. Maybe it's about wearing a one-piece bathing suit instead of two pieces, or making sure your shoulders are covered, your neckline's high enough, your shorts long enough. But no matter how much you comply, it's never enough. Because it's not really about modesty. It's about a need to control women. This might seem like a tangent, but it's an important factor here. Because if the need for propriety and purity is the woman's responsibility, then a man can act out without reprisal, leaving the woman to deal with the consequences. So as Amy was tying herself in knots trying to explain away Dr. Dolian's behavior, he could keep plotting his next advance. He also started talking about his dissatisfaction in his marriage, how there wasn't any passion. He never felt like he had been loved growing up. He said he'd always been looking for a deeper connection with someone, a connection like he felt with Amy. Later, toward the end of their time together, he would even tell Amy he wished he could just marry her. Their sessions started getting longer and longer, first 1 hour, then 2, then 3. And after the first year, Amy's insurance stopped paying, and she realized he wasn't charging her anymore. So she checked in at the office to talk through the options. The receptionist stumbled over her words and mumbled something like special discounts. Then Amy looked up and saw Dr. Dolian hovering in the background, smiling at her. We're going to continue Amy's story in the next episode. We're also going to look more closely at the complex realities of grooming and how Dr. Dolian was calculating his increasingly aggressive advances from day one. There's a lot to cover here, and we want to make sure we do it justice. In the meantime, you can learn more about Amy and connect with her through her website, amynordhues.com. You can also connect with us on Instagram at psycho.therapypodcast. There you'll find links to our webpage, as well as links to the show. And if you have found value in today's episode, please head on over to Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen and leave a rating and review. Your feedback helps us to grow and improve. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time.